I have hitherto studied brevity, frequently checking a propensity to amplify, as I wish to place before the reader facts and the principles, true or false, from which the facts originated, that he might have both before his mind in condensed form as elements for his own judgment. It is all important to clearness of apprehension in forming a judgment, that all extraneous matter be kept strictly in abeyance. It is by the introduction of irrelevant matter that our minds are confused, and when this object is gained by the designing and sophistical reasoner, he can lead us captive at pleasure. By this sleight of men, lying in wait to deceive, many are seduced in all ages, and I know no other method by which pious people are oftener misled, except by the ignorant abuse of wicked perversion of Scripture metaphors. When the late Dr. Cunningham, missionary to the Jews in London, in his magazine for April 1867, recounted the steps of defection by the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Scotland, his catalogue began with the practice of occasional hearing, as consistently tending and necessarily leading to all the rest. The second step was serving as jurors. At this stage, the Church had practically fallen from her testimony against the, quote, corrupt constitutions of either church or state, unquote. The process of reasoning on the case is both short and simple to any unsophisticated mind. Thus, if I can occupy the same pew with my neighbor on Sabbath, hearing his minister officially declare the covenants to be, quote, unlawful oaths, unquote, can I scruple to sit in the jury box with him on Monday to apply that constitutional law of the state if, quote, the powers that be, unquote, so command? Is not the case quite plain to any honest man? The third step is to use the elective franchise in choosing my representative to assist in the execution of the same law if the supreme civil power so requires before. Can I consistently hesitate? Certainly not. The fourth step is the oath of allegiance. This cannot be conscientiously refused by any who has employed a substitute to swear for him. Can he, as a Christian, or as a rational creature? No, he cannot. The fifth step is joining military associations to carry out all the provisions of the Constitution, and that one among the rest, which requires the jurant, if required, to slay his faithful brethren, the, quote, act of conformity, unquote. The fox, toleration, may be chained any day, and the tiger, conformity, let loose upon his former kind of prey, and the conduct of the occasional hearer in the British Isles opens the floodgate for all this actual immorality and possible cruelty. Now, however lightly these things may be looked upon by the world of the ungodly and by a generation of worldly professors, their nature and importance is not thereby either altered or seriously affected. While the Alcansar bond was conscientiously regarded, it gave vitality to the other symbols of our plighted faith, the very faith of the martyrs of Jesus, a number of their surviving compatriots being present and actively cooperating. And those who had just recently escaped the edge of the sword and come out of great tribulation were in the best condition to understand their duty and to feel the weight of covenant obligation. It is highly probable that henceforth few will be honored to follow in their footsteps till brought into a similar position. The course of backsliding by the R.P. Church in America was very similar to that in Scotland, only, as hinted above, with accelerated motion, to use a favorite phrase of Dr. Wiley. When Dr. MacLeod's overture for a great combination of Covenanters was under discussion, Dr. Wiley not only manifested apathy in regard to the proposed measure, but while generally deferring to Dr. MacLeod, he went so far as to signify his dislike to what he suggestively designated, quote, injudicious ligatures, unquote. Indeed, I heard a professed Covenanter, less prominent than Dr. Wiley, but of chief prominence in his own congregation, give expression to a similar sentiment. When told that his subscription to the call of a pastor was to be paid annually, he said, quote, "Oh, this is a free country. I cannot be bound," unquote. Thus it appears that a sense of covenant obligation, and especially the obligation of church covenants, was losing its hold on the consciences of many in the church, and for the same reason, political fraternization. Other instances of backsliding from the doctrine and order to which Reformed Presbyterians are solemnly pledged must not be omitted here. although the very mention of some of them be the occasion of ridicule rather than of conviction of sin, and to none more than to the backsliders. But Ishmael was an early prototype of the persecuting mockers and scoffers of the last times. Galatians 4, verse 29, 2 Peter 3, verse 3, and Jude 18. Where is now heard the proclamation of the banns of marriage, that barrier erected against clandestine contracts, corrupting the family, the church, and the state? This provision of our directory has gone into desuetude, become a dead letter, without even the formality of abrogation. Hence the increasing frequency of sinful desertions and scandalous divorces. The marriage covenant is viewed by many as merely a wholly civil contract. Were this true, then the parties could lawfully dissolve the connection by mutual dissent, as in other merely civil contracts. But the Lord, who instituted the ordinance in Eden before the fall, has taught far otherwise in the Holy Scriptures, both in the Old and New Testaments. Malachi 2, verses 14 and 15, and 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39. I know that many look upon the omission of this part of our uniformity as a light matter. But I also know that the omission is a breach of faith, of official oath, interpretative perjury, which is no light matter in the sight of God. Similar to the preceding step of defection is the omitting to read the lines of the psalm in the public social worship of God, and in a promiscuous assembly. What is the object of reading with an audible voice? Certainly that others may be instructed. But according to the Apostles' reasoning, instruction is impossible if the speaker or reader use a language unknown to the hearer. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 11. I am not ashamed to reason out a principle on which Paul condescended to reason against the learned men at Corinth, who were ignorant of the spirituality and extent of the moral law, the law of charity. I have been long familiar with the objections, the fallacies, which the corrupt ingenuity of carnal minds has opposed to this scriptural rule, framed at Westminster and sanctioned by the Church of Scotland. Some of these are, quote, the interruption spoils the music, unquote. Quote, all have psalm books and can read, or if not, they ought to be able to sing from memory, unquote, etc. These and such like objections are equally irrelevant and childish, evidencing the blindness of the carnal mind to the spirituality of the divine law. As to instruction of the ignorant or the edification of the intelligent, let the reader ask the question, what is the difference between, quote, speaking in an unknown tongue, unquote, or not speaking at all? The same is true of reading. It is evident that in neither case is edification possible. But the law of God in this very case is explicit and peremptory. Quote, let all things be done unto edifying, unquote, verse 26. The men of the Second Reformation knew something of the law of charity when they directed the mode of applying the second table of that law as they did in circumstances then existing, assigning a plain and sufficient reason, quote, while many cannot read, unquote. For if Paul thus applied the law in the case of one individual casually entering the worshipping assembly, and that one unlearned or even an unbeliever, verse 24, well might they reason a fortiori, quote, while they cannot read, unquote, in pointing out the right application of the second table of the law. I submit even to a prejudiced Christian, if he only yet trembles at the word of God, the few following texts for his consideration on this question of singing without lining in the public praise of God. Nehemiah 8, verse 8. Psalm 148, verse 12. Matthew 21, verse 16. And Romans 13, verse 10. I know not any modern innovation among Protestant churches, Presbyterian, and even Reformed Presbyterian churches, by which they approximate nearer in external form to the Romish Latin Mass than by continuous singing in public worshiping assemblies. Of course, in social praise, where all can read and it is known by the person conducting the exercise that none present is hindered, the reading is thus superseded. Allied to the foregoing innovation is the practice of conducting, quote, religious services over the dead, unquote. In the late residence of the deceased, carrying the corpse into the church, or repeating such heathen rites at the grave, for they are heathen rites incorporated by the Romish Church with Judaism and Christianity, and like other superstitious ceremonies, baptized, quote, Christian burial, unquote, few practices under the guise of religion have a more hardening tendency on spectators and even surviving relatives than the customary eulogies over the dead. And it may be that the indurating influence of the practice may be experienced by the person officiating while he is perfectly unconscious of the process. Another innovation which, like all others, is additional evidence of defection among professed Reformed Presbyterian churches, is the custom in church courts of what are called, quote, devotional exercises, unquote. These have such a pious name that any objection to them may be considered by some as a sacrilegious profanation. These extra devotions are lawful and dutiful on special occasions, but as engrafted on the long-established order of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, they are indeed an innovation borrowed from the larger, looser, more popular denominations. History attests that as the more spiritual part of religion declines in any church, the more does she resort to the ceremonial part. These devotional exercises in church courts have come into the covenanted church within my own recollection. Like most other novelties that have corrupted the body, these have been introduced within the memory of man. But some reader may ask, what are these devotional exercises? I answer, they are conducted very much as in the society now called prayer meeting. They consist of singing, reading the scriptures, and prayer. And who can object to this devotion? Well, I do, and I do so decidedly. Every duty is not to be done at all times. Quote, the Lord said to Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the people that they go forward, unquote. Action, not prayer, was present duty. Now, the immediate business of every church court is to judge faithfully for the Lord and impartially toward their brethren, that they be qualified for this responsible service. It has been the custom, time immemorial, in the Reformed Presbyterian Church to open the court at first meeting with prayer, and every successive session to do the same, that our fathers deemed sufficient in all ordinary cases. In extraordinary cases they prayed more earnestly with fasting, but we do not hear of their reading, praying, and singing. Continuously at every time of reassembling, and I am sure no one ever saw any judicatory of the Reformed Presbyterian name 50 years ago where a part of the members were at their devotions in the auditorium, another part eating lunch and, quote, cracking jokes, unquote, in the vestibule, and another part financially interested in the basement, all at the same time. I cannot think such exercises are helpful to the proper business for the transaction of which the court meets, nor that the extra time employed in the devotions facilitates or accelerates judicial decisions. The only apparent reason for the innovation is to conform to the customs of more respectable churches, as in other things.